This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Katherine Shen. In the LGBTQ community, found or chosen family can be crucial. It's the idea of a social support system beyond your biological family, and it's a theme that Connecticut native Ella Dawson explores in her new book, But How Are You, Really? What began as a memoir is now a work of literary fiction, following 27-year-old Charlotte, or Charlie Thorne, over 72 hours, asking the question, can a college reunion change your life? And here with us to talk about her book and the themes of second family, burnout, biphobia, and more is Ella Dawson herself. Ella's also a sex and culture critic based in New York City. Ella, thank you so much for joining us today.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me.
And for our listeners, we'd love to know, what does found family mean to you? And what questions do you have for Ella? Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So Ella, previously you've talked about how this book went through many transformations as you were working on it. Can you walk us through some of that transformations, starting with where did the idea come from?
Yeah, so I originally thought that I was going to write an essay collection or memoir exploring casual sex and hookup culture. I was really interested in what dating and relationships and sexuality look like on college campuses based on my own experience navigating that mess in my teens and early 20s at Wesleyan as an undergrad in Middletown. And so I went to my 5-year college reunion in 2019, and I was hoping to interview people that I had hooked up with when I was an undergrad and talk to other students, or former students, that is, about their experiences. And instead, what I wound up realizing pretty quickly was I was not at all an expert, and I write a full book about those topics in nonfiction, but I had this idea for what I originally thought would be a romance novel about had hooked up when they were undergraduates and not really taken each other seriously, and maybe used each other a little bit because they were still in a very young, immature place in their lives.
Sure.
But when they face each other again at their 5-year college reunion, suddenly maybe they appreciate each other more. There's all of this chemistry, but they also have to deal with the baggage of who have we become after 5 years in the real world. So that was like the kernel of an idea that I had, and it certainly evolved from there as well. But definitely go to your college reunions. You wind up having a lot of weird ideas.
That's so fascinating because, when we're talking about this earlier, I was actually thinking I actually haven't gone to one. Because a lot of the people that I connected really well during my college years, I'm still in contact with them. And we all kind of had this we are already in communication, why bother? But I have also been thinking, but it could be a good time. So I think that's the inspo.
Yeah. I hear that from a lot of people, that they either didn't know that college reunions existed or why would I go? But for me, I think part of the joy of a college reunion is returning to a certain place.
Right.
And I mean, at Wesleyan, you get to stay in the dorms if you want to, and you get to roam around campus. It's a very strange sensory experience. And I think of it as being a bit like a snow globe. It's this weird pocket in time where you get to kind of escape your timeline and live in nostalgia. And to me, it was such an evocative potential setting for a story, because it's your sense of time, your sense of who you are, what age you are, become warped in this very fun and strange way. So I recommend going and get a crew together if you can.
There you go. Yeah. Now I'm going to have to plan that. And I'm nodding my head, even though you can't see me, but because you talk about setting. And I think college campuses is such a popular setting for many, many fictions across the globe, and honestly across literary history, I think. And with your own experience, you touched on it a little bit just now, your own personal experience at the reunion, and also witnessing other people's experiences on top of your own professional experiences, talking to other people's, discussing their personal problems as a sex and culture critic. How does all of that informed how you wrote this, especially since it went through different changes, going from potentially a memoir to potentially a romance novel to now a fiction novel?
Yeah, I don't even know where to start. That is
Yeah,
such a good
I mean, it's a
question.
big question.
Yeah, there are a lot of different themes that run through the book. And people have asked me, I just got back from book tour, and a few different people asked me, how did you go from writing personal essays about sex and culture and relationships to writing fiction? And for me, the themes are still the same.
Right.
This book explores what does it mean to really connect and be vulnerable with people? How does your mental health impact your relationships? And that can be romantic or sexual relationships, but it can also be friendships. It can be workplace relationships, workplace connections. How do we really communicate with one another? How do we be honest about what we need in life and what we need the people in our lives to help us with? The title poses a big question, but how are you really? And that's a question that is very ominous, I think, if you're in a place in life where you're feeling ashamed or insecure. And at a college campus, it's a way of asking, or at a college reunion, it's a way of asking, like, okay, now that you've given me the small talk overview, are you really doing okay? And those are questions that I've had to interact with a lot in my writing while navigating sex and culture, because in order to have healthy, wonderful relationships with people, you need to be able to be vulnerable and honest and to ask intimidating questions. And I think in a more hookup culture environment, that type of conversation is discouraged and incredibly difficult, because you're thinking of people in terms of, how do I have a good time instead of how do I have like a genuine connection with whoever I'm chatting with at this party. And so it's all, to me, it's like a big muddled mess of embarrassing emotions, but wonderful potential for connection and falling in love and finding the community support that you need. So I don't know, but also it kind of just happened.
Yeah.
I have no regrets.
And that's the title of your next book. It kind of just happened. I think. Well,
Yeah, honestly, that would fit.
well, and then I know you mentioned just a little bit right now about the question of how are you really being the title of your book. Did that come out organically? Because as we're chatting, I'm thinking, because you mentioned being genuine, finding truth, and that is one of those questions where the person being asked the question has a very short amount of time to think about, do I want to answer that question truthfully, or do I want to just say, oh, I'm fine?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that I really struggle with too. When people ask me how I really am, there's a lot of, oh, I'm fine. Oh, I'm great. And I think it's a very normal reaction that we all have of, should I be defensive in this moment? Should I put on an act? Or is this someone who I feel safe enough giving the real version to? The original title for this book, all while I was writing it, well, the first draft was Cranky Millennial Romance.
That's so
But
good.
yes, but as the book became a real book, the title was just The Reunion.
Mm,
And I really saw it as a specific story about this environment and these characters. But first of all, there are a lot of books called The Reunion. So I had to have a conversation with my editor where she was like, I don't know. But we really, we didn't struggle for a new title, but it definitely took a lot of group brainstorms and texting my friends for ideas. And my friend Gabe Rosenberg, I need to give him full credit for coming up with But How Are You Really as the final choice. It was his suggestion because it does kind of encapsulate the themes of the book of being honest about your mental health. Who can you be honest with? Who will really show up for you? As well as just the small talk of the reunion. And there are several scenes where a character will ask Charlotte that question, and she goes through that mental calculus of, do I really want to go there?
right.
And the main lesson she really learns throughout the book is you actually have to tell the truth to the people who care about you in order to be better, in order to fix your life, as fraught and intimidating as it is.
Well, and I definitely want to talk about some of the bigger themes that you are trying to get into with this story. But I also want to ask first, because you've shared so much of this, based on your own experience going to your own college reunion, how much of your story is still in this novel? How much of Ella is Charlotte slash Charlie? And can you also talk about through those lenses, how do you want readers to engage with your characters, even when she's struggling?
Yeah, Charlotte and I are very different. I have an amazingly supportive family, and she's very much on her own in this world. She no longer speaks to her parents. I also just, I'm very lucky that I've always had a really wonderful supportive community. Like, there are a lot of things that she experiences that are inspired by my friends and challenges that they've had. Um, but as a Connecticut girly who grew up in a fairly waspy environment, I was not a big let's have direct conversations about our feelings and have direct confrontation.
Sure.
And so that was definitely something that I almost learned how to do while writing Charlotte. And I also have experiences with emotionally abusive and toxic relationships. And one of the key parts of Charlotte's story is that she is an abuse survivor. She has this very complicated dynamic with her mother, but she also was in an emotionally abusive relationship in college. And that colors a lot of the way that she approaches the world. She's probably living with some undiagnosed PTSD, although that's not diagnosed in the book. But a lot of her behavior is the result of different trauma responses and defense mechanisms that she's learned. And my hope is that for readers, being in Charlotte's brain can be a bit frustrating because she is in this self sabotaging cycle and she has difficulty advocating for herself. But I really hope that being in her brain can help folks understand the way that trauma can influence your thinking and
Right.
your emotional responses. And a lot of people have experienced those dynamics, but if you haven't, I hope that it will help build a bit of empathy and understanding for when people in your life who are survivors behave in ways be difficult to be empathetic and patient about.
And I think the peeling back the layers is such an ongoing theme with this book, and it also points to the difference between growing up and being a grown up, and the lesson that pretending to be okay isn't the same as being okay. I really love those two differences. Can you talk about those differences?
Yeah, I love the dichotomy between being a grown up and feeling like a grown up. I think, especially at a college reunion, that's a moment where you start to really feel like at age 27, what have I built for myself? Where is my career going? Am I on the specific timeline that I'm supposed to be on? There are all these different expectations
Right.
around marriage and being a parent and where you should be in your career at certain moments in time of your life. And in reality, things happen at different times. People want different things. They want different paths. They might realize, oh, I've been on this wrong track. And no one is ever exactly where they're supposed to be on the timeline. And the timeline itself is a fiction, it's a social creation. Charlotte goes to her 5 year reunion and feels like such a failure because her career isn't what she expected it to be. She's become super isolated. She's really living in survival mode every single day, just trying to get through and keep paying rent. And when she's surrounded by other alumni who have really fashionable careers or are getting engaged, it's really frightening and can really bring up a lot of feelings of shame and not feeling good about yourself.
Right.
And I think that I just went to my 10-year reunion and it's funny because I was a few weeks away from publishing this book, which is really the only goal that I've ever had is to someday be an author.
Yeah.
And yet I still felt so much imposter syndrome and embarrassment
Mm.
because, oh, I'm not married, or oh, these people are having babies and like that's
Right.
amazing for them. But like I just moved into my own apartment and live alone for the first time in my life in my 30s. So those feelings of, am I a real grown up or am I just posing as one? I feel like they never fully go away for all of us.
Sure.
And the more that we, the easier it is to say like, no, this is kind of an impossible expectation, especially for millennials and for folks who are where the traditional career paths don't really exist anymore. And economic precarity is becoming really pervasive and rent is super high. Like it's for younger generations. Like, I mean, boomers and Gen X folks tell me like we have the same challenges, and that's very true. But like for young people today, it's even harder to reach those adult milestones.
Sure.
Owning a house, that's laughable to me. So I think we have to really think about what does being a grown up even mean, and how do we help people understand that they are grown ups and that our definition just has to shift.
Right. I was going to say, in this economy, you're right. And
Exactly.
honestly, you read any novel, I think we all have an understanding that life does not ever really go to plan. So,
Yes.
you've been listening to Ella Dawson, who's a sex and culture critic and author of "But How Are You Really?" She'll be staying with us, and we'll continue this conversation and talk about how the theme of found family shows up in this book after a quick break. And listeners, we'd love to know, what does found family mean to you? Let us know, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live.
Learning the hard way, learning the hard way, learning the hard way to be true. Now I'm learning the hard way. Birds of a feather, we rock together. And if we got a problem, we talk together. Oh, and down south, escape the bad weather. I said,
This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. This hour, we're speaking with Ella Dawson, who's a Connecticut-born sex and culture critic who just published her first book. But How Are You Really? Follows 27-year-old Charlotte, or Charlie, as she navigates biphobia, burnout, and much more. And back with us to discuss is Ella herself. And just a quick reminder for our listeners that if you have any questions, let us know. Give us a call at 888-720-9677 or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Ella, we've been talking about lots of big themes in your novel. Can you touch on the importance of queer representation in storytelling and also how writing this book helped you explore that?
Yeah, so Charlotte is proudly bisexual. It's a huge part of her character, and she's had relationships with men, with women, with folks of different genders, and it is something that contributed to the dissolution of her relationship with her parents, with her mother in particular. Her mother did not respond all that well to Charlotte coming out in high school, and so it is a big part of her story and her personality. And I wanted to write about biphobia in particular because there are a lot of myths about bisexual people, bisexual women in particular, that we are promiscuous, that we're dishonest, that we're just posing as bisexual for attention from men, that we're just confused. And all of those different stereotypes contribute to a real stigma of being bisexual that puts bisexual people at risk of mistreatment and abuse. There are some very strange statistics about how bisexual women are at an increased risk of domestic violence and sexual violence when dating cis men as compared to their straight female peers. And so those are issues that I really wanted to explore in Charlotte's story. I myself am bisexual, so I've experienced these firsthand and really wanted to see more bisexual representation in fiction. And for Charlotte, when she goes to college, that's her first opportunity to really explore her queerness, both as a bisexual woman and as someone who's just not super feminine. You know, she really enjoys dressing she's a thrift shop dirtbag. Like, she loves wearing more comfortable men's clothes. And college is the first opportunity where she gets to really relax and be herself. And in part, that is because she joins this amazing group of queer friends who have their own experiences being alienated from their families and who really embrace who she is and help her flourish. And I think queer chosen family is so important, especially to talk about during Pride Month, because being part of a queer community and having that second family, a lot of folks who are queer do have complicated relationships with their families, and it can be easier to turn to your queer friends for support, for understanding, for assistance in emergencies, for mutual aid. And it was really important to me that Charlotte have this wonderful clique of friends from college who are able to call her out on, you seem really depressed. You know, your boss seems kind of terrible. What's going on in your life? How are you really doing? And they're wonderful. They were fun for me to write. And I wish I had a group of friends as amazing as this. I do have amazing friends, but I hope that everyone who is a young queer person can find those people who really show up for them.
Well, and because you talked about your own college experience at Wesleyan, playing a role in planning sort of your story here, your story / Charlotte's story, which is, I think, a mishmash. You know, how did writing this book help you imagine what queer community could mean? And on top of that, you know, thinking about your own college experience.
Yeah, so I actually was pretty closeted when I was in college. Because of biphobia, I had kind of internalized this idea that, you know, maybe I am just doing this for male attention. Maybe I'm not really bisexual. You know, I don't have as much experience dating women. And I kind of went back into the closet in college, which is strange to think about because Wesleyan was a very queer-friendly school. I think I just looked at other queer students and they seemed so confident in who they were, at least to my insecure mind, that I thought, well, you know, they have it all figured out and I'm probably an interloper. So a lot of writing this book for me was the college experience I wish I'd had of being more open about my sexuality. And I remember standing outside of the LGBTQ student program house and wanting to go inside and not feeling like I deserved to walk through those doors. And that's something that I tried to capture in the book too, of these spaces are incredibly important. And most of the time they're very welcoming, no matter where you are in your journey of self-understanding. So that was those were a big part of the themes that I wanted to capture. I forgot the second part of your question. I apologize.
Oh, no apologies necessary. I mean, this is life, right? You never know.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to talk about, you know, I mean, you talked about your college experience and writing this book. Did it help you imagine what queer community could mean? Especially now you're an adult, you're a different person, but what could it mean still?
Yeah, I've put a lot of effort into building up a queer community for myself now that I'm in my 30s, and I live in New York City now. There's a lot of queer spaces, from bars to bookshops. There are a lot of places where I can go and connect and meet other queer folks. And for me, like, I really felt the importance of that queer community when I left an abusive relationship during the pandemic. A lot of friends who I had been kind of isolated from over the course of that relationship immediately resurfaced to be like, hey, first of all, congratulations. So glad you're out of that situation. Do you need somewhere to stay? Do you need a job? Will you come pet sit for me? Do you want to come stay at my place while I'm out of town? Like, a lot of people just showing up and offering support and offering a place to crash, offering a sympathetic ear. And I mean, some of those people were straight, but a lot of them were queer and understood how frightening it is to not really know where you're going to stay the next day, like not really knowing what you're doing with the rest of your life now that this relationship has ended. And I was very lucky that I had a safe place, a soft place to land. I was able to stay with my parents, but it was really nice to have people show up for me, particularly in New York City, and say, like, my door is open, here's my spare key.
Well, and we do get glimpses of that openness in the book, and the relationships in this story are so deep, especially between the main character and another character named Jackie. We'd love to ask you to read an excerpt, and noting that you may have to do a little bit of censoring for this crescendo moment that we're going to be hearing.
Yes. Yes, I did. I wrote in my book and removed some swear words.
All right. Whenever you're ready.
Yeah, so I can offer just a little bit of context.
Sure.
Jackie is Charlotte's best friend from college, who she's become somewhat distant from over the last few years. And Jackie is if Charlotte is shy and kind of reserved, Jackie is the much more blunt friend, and Jackie's become very frustrated watching Charlotte push people away, and also Jackie really wants Charlotte to quit her job. So this scene is kind of the confrontation that's been brewing between them all weekend. Shut the F up, Charlotte startled. Jackie rolled her eyes, her voice a hard drawl. I'm sorry that your ex-boyfriend showed up and ruined your night. He's a pig, but I'm not going to sit here and listen to the BS he installed in your brain. I know you don't believe that about yourself, and Reese doesn't either. Jackie's eyes narrowed. Give me your hand. What? She snatched Charlotte's hand from her mouth and held it up to her face. You are literally eating yourself. Do you see this? Jackie waved her hand around by the wrist, forcing Charlotte to see her bleeding cuticles. So you're a depressed bisexual with terrible parents. That doesn't mean you don't know how to love someone. Do you hear me? Charlotte stared at her, stuck between years of hurt and the dark laugh growing in her throat. She yanked her hand back and curled her nails into her palm. Jackie barreled on. You didn't deserve how Ben treated you. That's why you left him. And you don't deserve how your mother treated you. That's why she's not in your life. But don't you dare write off Reese. It's just another way for you to give up on yourself. And that's exactly what your mom would want you to do. And Roger, for that matter. The urge to laugh at her best friend's tough love evaporated. Please don't bring my job into this. Jackie's eyes flashed. Oh, I think we should because you're a dummy if you don't see the connection. Charlotte crossed her arms over her chest, torn between desperation to avoid the conflict that had been brewing all weekend, and anger that Jackie wouldn't let this go. Please just drop it. No, I'm not going to keep my mouth shut anymore. She'd clearly been thinking about this for a while, the words flying off her tongue.
Well, as those words flew off your tongue, I'm thinking we all probably want a friend that will tell us pretty straight up on what the truth is. And we really love this moment. I mean, what a monologue from Jackie. And we'll love your thoughts about how this really solidifies the depth of these relationships and also the idea of found family.
Yeah, Jackie is kind of the sister that Charlotte never wanted. She knows Charlotte extremely well. She knows her defense mechanism. She knows that she avoids things and kind of just suffers quietly. And Jackie is very frustrated seeing someone she loves so much suffer. And Jackie wants to snap her out of it. Unfortunately, those tough love conversations often drive people further underground. They can really drive people away, and it does not land with Charlotte in this moment. Charlotte gets very annoyed, and minor spoiler, she winds up storming out shortly after this conversation. But at the same time, because Jackie knows Charlotte so well and knows the long history of her insecurity and the way that she kind of inadvertently seeks out these negative dynamics with people, Jackie is able to say, I know why you're behaving this way. I know who has told you in your life that you deserve this, and I'm here to tell you that they were wrong. And that type of friendship is so vital and so life-saving very often. And while Charlotte can't really hear it in this moment, Jackie's words really stick with her and do in the long run sink in and help her. But I am so grateful for the friends in my life who will give me the tough love monologue, even if I don't hear it right away. And those people they're such a gift. But it was so much fun for me to write these two characters because they're both right. Jackie is being kind of sanctimonious and unrealistic. Charlotte does have a lot of economic anxiety that make it very difficult to just quit her job, whereas Jackie has a lot more economic security and privilege. But at the same time, Charlotte's been a terrible friend and has really not shown up for Jackie. And so it was very fun to write fight scenes between them where they both have a point, but they're not really able to hear the other person just yet.
And you've been listening to Ella Dawson, who's a sex and culture critic and author of But How Are You, Really? She'll be staying with us, and we'll continue this conversation after a quick break. Let us know if you have any questions, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Back with us this hour is Ella Dawson. She's a sex and culture critic and also the author of the new novel, But How Are You, Really? And Ella, I want to jump straight to more questions for you. We've been talking about your debut novel, and also you mentioned Pride Month earlier. Do you want to quickly talk about? We have conversations with the Connecticut Library Association almost yearly, and they tell us that the majority of book removal or ban requests are books with LGBTQIA themes or authors versus BIPOC authors and themes. Does that surprise you? And was that a part of sort of your process when you're working on how this book is going to roll out?
Yeah, I was very worried in the last year or two revising the book about the potential backlash that it might receive, considering it's about a bisexual woman. And it's frustrating because I've grown up in Connecticut. I've lived most of my life in Connecticut, and I adore the Greenwich Public Library. I wrote a bunch of my book in the Greenwich Public Library, but I was genuinely quite nervous about potential response from my neighbors and from my hometown about the book. Connecticut is such a wonderful progressive state, but we certainly have this rising book ban culture across the state. And I really felt that chilling effect, that fear as I was working on the book. So far, I've been really lucky that there hasn't been a backlash, but it's definitely something that I think about and that I've seen happen to other authors. And it's quite that folks in Connecticut are aware that while Connecticut is a lovely, wonderful place, these forces are still happening in our own communities, and that it's really worth paying attention and getting involved.
Right. And earlier we talked a little about your upbringing here in Connecticut, and you went to college at Wesleyan. How would you say your Connecticut roots, your upbringing here, informed how you think about queer identity and queer community as an adult?
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing how much has changed in the last few years, in the last decade.
Right.
But when I went to high school and when I was discovering my queerness, that was the late 2000s and early 2010s. And we were not a super queer-friendly place. Like, even if the state's politics were better than some of other United States places, like, I really felt a pressure to be straight and to not communicate anything outside of that norm, even just in my high school. That was a very strange moment in time. Like Katy Perry's I Kissed a Girl was a very popular song, but bisexuality was still a concept that people didn't believe existed, at least in my high school. And there was just like a vague homophobia that I experienced and was very aware of. And even when I moved back to Connecticut during the pandemic after leaving my ex-boyfriend, I picked up on like very subtle types of homophobia that I thought would no longer exist in Connecticut, given how much progress has been made. There are very few like visibly queer people in my hometown of Greenwich. I love Greenwich. I don't want to throw shade on Greenwich, but it is a pretty traditional environment. And it's made me really happy connecting with queer young people across the state. I went to a Connecticut Pride event last year up in Waterbury. So there are definitely pockets of wonderful queer community across Connecticut, but I grew up in a fairly waspy, conformist moment in the state's life, I would say. I always joke with people like growing up in Greenwich was like growing up in a J. Crew catalog, and not always the warmest place to be a baby feminist bisexual teenager. So that definitely informed the book, and I'm really glad that a lot of progress has been made, but we still got more work to do.
Well, and I love that trajectory just because there was so much that you were grappling with. And I think that would resonate with a lot of people, not just people in the local area, but I imagine statewide as well. So we talked a bunch about, your process in terms of turning this potential memoir romance novel into a literary fiction. But I want to also talk more about your work as a sex and culture critic. Can you tell us, how did that happen?
Yeah, great question. Mostly by accident. For most of my 20s, I did have like a normal day job as a social media manager, but after hours, I ran a blog, which is feels kind of dated to say, but I had a blog where I wrote about hookup culture and mental health, and my kind of breakout moment was that I wrote about living with STIs, living with genital herpes, which is wildly stigmatized still to this day, even though it is a very, very common STI. Something like 2/3 of the world's population has HSV1, herpes simplex virus strain 1, which often presents as oral herpes, but can be genital and is often asymptomatic. And I got herpes when I was in college and was kind of infuriated by those statistics because I realized how common it was, and yet I'd never had a single conversation about herpes in my life that wasn't just like jokes about getting herpes in Vegas or something. And so I wrote just an essay about my experiences dating with herpes, and that went viral, no pun intended. And overnight I became kind of the face of herpes in my early 20s, which was not part of the career plan.
You know, I was just going to say that, but you said it.
Yes. But yeah, that gave me a really wonderful platform and built the foundation for the rest of my career as a sex and culture critic, writing more generally about sexual health and communication with your partners. And at this point in my life, herpes is like very irrelevant to me. I haven't had an outbreak in years and years. I forget that I have it most of the time. And anybody who I date is, thankfully, by the time you reach your 30s, everyone's like, oh yeah, that's not a big deal. But it is, it's always funny to meet people who are like, oh, you're the herpes girl. And I'm like, well, now I am an author, but thank you.
Right. Add that on to your profile, I suppose. Yeah. And I mean, you've had so many different platforms and with so many different mediums, what has the experience been like for you with your readers, not just with the book, but also with your personal essays? Or are there any different?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see a huge difference. I mean, the only difference between writing the book and the rest of my writing is that it was very strange to work on this book kind of in isolation and in private for 5 years, whereas whenever I write something online, I get to put it out in the world somewhat immediately and hear from readers right away about what resonated with them and what their different perspective might be. And I've been very lucky to build a real relationship with a lot of my readers over the years through social media and as a Patreon creator. And it's been very nerve-wracking putting this book out into the world and saying, oh, I hope you guys like it. I've spent 5 years working on it, but with no insight as to how it might do. And it's been wonderful just in the last 2 weeks hearing from readers, both folks who have read my work for years and people who are just kind of stumbling across it in a bookstore and hearing what resonates with them. And it's been really wonderful and a big relief. But I'm very lucky that I do have readers who I've gotten to know and who have given me feedback. And it's been, honestly, like I think when people hear that I'm a sex writer, they expect readers to be inappropriate with me or salacious. But in general, I think people are so excited that we're having conversations about sexual health or about relationships, these really vulnerable topics, that readers tend to be very vulnerable and respectful with me about their own experiences. And I'm really lucky and grateful that people have supported my work and shared with me. And I've learned a lot from my readers over the last decade, I suppose, of writing online.
Well, it sounds like you're breaking so many different barriers in so many different ways with your various platforms. And you speaking of what's resonating with readers, what would you like listeners today to take away from this conversation but how are you really?
Yeah, I certainly think that we have a long way to go in understanding domestic violence and abusive relationships. We've had a very strange few years talking about those topics, from the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial that really reinforced some awful stereotypes about domestic violence and who might be a victim and how it functions. Covering that trial took years away from my sanity and I think brought us backward in a lot of ways. And I hope that people who read the book will question some of their assumptions about what abuse looks like and how victims might behave. Because I think that the stories that we usually see around abuse victims is there's either the revenge tale where the person is radicalized by this traumatic experience and then goes out for violent revenge, which, like, good for you, girl. Those movies are fun, but that's not how everyone reacts. Or you see, like, the very principled victim who has been just heartbroken by this experience and really wants justice, or just completely falls apart. When in reality, millions of us are living with different types of trauma and different types of abuse or assault, and are just trying to get through and live our lives and find healing in whatever that means to us. And Charlotte as a character is not really looking for justice or for revenge. She just wants to be okay. And that is also a totally acceptable response to experiencing a traumatic experience. And thankfully, she has a lot of friends who understand that and support her and just listen to her and what she needs. And I hope that that is useful for readers and for survivors. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you so much for sharing Charlotte with us. You've been listening to Ella Dawson, who's the author and sex and culture critic. Thank you so much for your time today, Ella.
Thank you so much for having me.
You can learn more about her book, But How Are You Really?, on our website at ctpublic.org/wherewelive. I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Katie Pellico. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you so much for listening.